Every day, we are used to easy access to food. It's easy to believe everything's okay, and that hunger is only a problem during times of drought, and that it's only worthwhile declaring an emergency when animals and then people start dying. But we would be wrong. Chronic food insecurity exists and affects more than a quarter of Kenya's population. That means more than 10 million of our relatives, neighbors, and friends regularly cannot access adequate food or afford to buy it. The causes of food insecurity are varied, from climate change and limited water access, to the inability to move food to where it needs to go, and many empty political promises. Perhaps the most damaging has been the failure to support rural farmers and those plagued by food insecurity to be part of the solution. But change is always possible. It's time to imagine a better future for Kenya, where everyone has the right to feed themselves in dignity. It's time for you and I to act, to hold our leaders responsible and demand change. Visit
Food is something that we all have a right to. And right now we're in the middle of what I consider an existential crisis because we need to eat and not everybody has the privilege of food.
My introduction to the world of food was by involvement in a research project which was looking at the period between 2007 and 2012, which was a time when there was a lot of volatility in the global food prices because of several crises. And we here in Kenya experienced that when the price of unga shot astronomically, and then we had protests, the Unga Revolution, if you remember that. So along with some colleagues in 4 other countries, we were looking at food rights and food riots was the title of the study, and what really triggers state response or state accountability for hunger, and how do you build on the momentum of the episodic protest to actually build accountability for the right to food. So the other countries, if you're interested, were Bangladesh, Cameroon, India, and Mozambique. And I'll say a few more words about that if we have a chance. Thank you.
I do practice food sovereignty, which I find it so relieving and so good. In my 1/8 of a quarter acre, I have 19 chickens which run across the highway, and they all know how to get back home. So we've not needed to buy eggs for the last 6 years, not a single egg. And I said, wow. And then we have tunderemas growing across the fence this and that way, and we've not needed to buy any greens.
What is underema?
African spinach. It's a climate tendril. And you cook it and you eat it with your ugali, which I can speak about later. But right now, I coordinate an organization called the Kenya Food Rights Alliance that precedes the route to food just a little, but we are very big, good sisters. And we try to bring the issues of science and technology into policy and common language.
Our foundation, we focus a lot on supporting indigenous people and their right to resources within the frame of UNDRIP, United Nations Declaration for Rights for Indigenous People. We work globally on self-determination of indigenous people. In Kenya, we currently focus a lot on supporting indigenous people, mostly pastoralists, in securing their territorial rights within the frame of the Community Land Act that became law in 2016. I'm happy to join this panel. I'm sorry, it's very hard to connect virtually for other meetings and physical, but I'll try my best to air my view. Thank you very much.
I think to kickstart our conversation today, I came across a paper that was authored by Dr. Celestine, and I'm going to read a statement there that caught my attention, and I think it's a good place for us to start this evening. And you said, a weak Kenyan moral economy that has created a system in which Kenyans do not expect their government to provide for their right to food. I'm curious to know what was going through your mind when you wrote that. And I think maybe for the sake of everybody, for us to understand, when you say a weak moral economy in regards to our right to food, what does that actually mean?
Okay, well, a fancy word for something very simple, which is simply what kind of expectations do we as citizens have of our government? So when we read the news stories or we hear them, of people in distress in the northern parts of the country, in the eastern region of the country, do we just think that is an inevitable consequence of living in the arid and semi-arid areas, yeah? Or do we think someone is wrong there, something should have been done right so this doesn't happen? That's all really that a moral economy means, that it's through various engagements between states and citizens, some understanding has been created over time so that we consider it morally reprehensible for citizens to be dying of hunger or to be in a situation where they should just accept that they'll always be chronically hungry. Yeah, that's really what it means. And the phrase is taken from a blog that we did for Route to Food, taken from the published work that we did for the project. And it came from having had several focus group discussions in different places. So for the Kenya study, we decided to compare a rural area that experiences chronic hunger, so we went to Ikuda, and a poor urban neighborhood where people were not only hungry, but had also been active in the protests. So we went to Mathare and spoke to several community activists there. And so we found that there were actually broadly two views about the whole idea of the constitutional right to food. In one sense, it was simply the state should give free food in moments of crisis to people. Now, that doesn't sustain a conversation for long, because you can only then talk about food aid and how it's not functioning properly. And there ends the conversation, right? Then there were those who had a much more expansive view of what the right to food should mean. And with those, you could then have a longer conversation about why is food taxed the same way as non-essential commodities? Why do we have a strategic grain reserve that is always empty when there's a crisis? Why do we have food import subsidies, and who do they benefit, etc.? So there's a more expansive view, and that one accommodates a better understanding of the moral economy. Yeah.
Still on the issue of the moral economy, and this is more to Dr. Hassan, there's something you mentioned in your earlier statement around the northern frontier, arid, semi-arid areas. And I think we've been conditioned as a nation to only identify with a food crisis when we see images of malnourished children, of crops, of farmland that's left with no crops, and most recently, I think, in the mainstream media, where we had stories of the cost of livestock being sold at throwaway prices. Dr. Hassan, as someone who has expertise in biodiversity in terms of the different environments where we look at crop production and livestock production, what does that mean for you in the work that you do, where as a nation, we only get triggered by such images for us to take something as food crisis as a serious matter?
Thank you. I think we need to go back to very basics. Most of you recently have been following news about the happenings in northern Kenya and much of the arid and semi-arid area, the droughts and the famine and the dying children and water shortages, all these things you see on the TV. It must be very scary for the rest of you. And you must be asking yourself, why then should such people or those populations stay in those areas that are very harsh? And you are forgiven because when you are far away and you don't know what's going on in this type of system, then you are bound to sympathize with people staying here or living in this type of ecosystem. So for those of us who grew up here and who also studied this type of system, we felt that this can be avoided, or this type of farming or shops can be avoided. Of course, nature is harsh.
Recording in progress.
But I think major problem has to do with a lot of historical inequalities that has been experienced since colonial time. If you remember very well, during the colonial period, the bulk of the country, the arid and semi-arid area, or the country was divided into two regions, high-yielding area and low-yielding area. So this region of the country was classified as low potential region, and therefore there was no investment in infrastructure, there was no investment in any development of matter here. And in the post-colonial period, we inherited the same type of policy that never really regarded developing this part of the country. And therefore, the livestock and the communities here, because the system here works as a system that has people, has land, has a livestock. And each of these has different type of parameters that affects its robustness, its ability to feed the people. But because of this forgotten ecosystem, the people have to struggle a lot. And therefore, the government or the policymakers feel that this group of people are quite primitive. They keep a lot of livestock. They keep on wandering from place to place, and then they end up losing their livestock to drought. So it's a very simple narrative. But that's not the whole truth. The truth is the land here, the people here, the livestock here are very well adapted to this ecosystem, and they can provide the food for the people here and even for the rest of the country. Currently, pastoralism produces around 30% of national GDP overall. The last 5 years, that's the figure. And it can feed the population here, and you don't need to really have food problem. But the problem is policy inequality. One, these livestock people produce have no market. Two, there isn't any infrastructure like marketing facility or health facility. All this thing has been downtrodden for a long time. It has been forgotten completely. So people wait for the government to intervene, but then when there's no intervention, then livestock actually have to die because drought will come, and we are not prepared for drought. When we are not equally prepared, then the drought has to have very harsh effect. Now with climate change, that's global, then the drought that usually occurs now occur even more frequently, and then we have more losses. And the people who have been driving the narrative of poor ecosystem, less performing ecosystem, now have very good story to tell that these people actually have to adapt something different to completely what they have been used to. That now is about moral economy. Do people have to change their lifestyle because the government has provided their part of the bargain to support a system that they are culturally tied to, that the livestock, the land that can only support that type of production? Why, for example, can the farmers in central Kenya farming coffee are not told to abandon coffee farming when the industry is not performing, when there's no market? Why does the government give an enabling policy or support, form a task force to ask about coffee performance and not pastoralism? So this is a very structural problem. And therefore, if we need to provide food for this type of population that are sort of marginalized, ecological marginal, but politically marginalized, then we need to think afresh and say, how do you use this land? And one very important thing that's happening now is the land law. There's now a new law on customary tenure right. The Community Land Act that came into law in 2016 is providing some very good window for committing out all land. So tenure security is a very good platform for thinking about food security in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hassan. There are 3 words you've said, and I'd just like you to note them down because we're going to get back into delving into that discussion later in the conversation. The words are primitive, land tenure, and land act. But I'd like to invite Dr. Maingi to share his thoughts. I mean, given that you are a living, practicing agroecologist, and what I hear Dr. Celestine and Dr. Hassan say is in terms of where does the responsibility fall within our infrastructure, within our policies, within our institutions that are responsible to make sure that citizens have access to affordable, nutritious food. Where do you think that responsibility lies, and what are some of the the opportunities, or actually opportunity gaps that we are overlooking. I mean, like Dr. Hassan has pointed out genuinely, when we look at crop production, like cash crops like coffee, there are measures or mitigation measures in place to ensure that production continues and sale of the coffee still happens. Why is it different when you're looking at, say, livestock production, which is a big part of the pastoralist community? So my question then becomes, with which institution does responsibility lie? And what are the opportunity gaps in terms of a broad view of agroecology that we are missing out on because we are stuck in our ways, so to speak?
I should have left the question to Dr. Celestine because now we're getting into the legal issues. But nature and the way nature is set, when we are living in harmony with nature, it should be sustainably providing and supporting us. And so right at the international level, you have the Convention of Biological Diversity that asks us to do so many things to treat nature, not only for this current generation, but generations that shall come. And there are so many ecosystem services that we are supposed to derive from nature, one of them being not just sustenance, but the food itself. And so whether you're in the marginalized areas, climate-wise, or the Dr. Hassan called it the good areas, high potential areas. The first look is how you treat nature and how nature treats you back. And so when it comes now to policy, we are supposed to set up policies that are supportive of nature, not against and wanton extractive exploitation of nature. And so when we are doing that exploitation of nature, whether it's livestock or agriculture, in a way that spoils the natural resources for future and for current families, then we don't have, not families, people, then we don't have much too far to look if we are looking for somebody to blame. And so in the Kenyan aspect, not only are the international conventions part and parcel of the laws in Kenya, but we also have the Constitution of Kenya. And so whether it's the biodiversity that belongs to us and the things that we do to that biodiversity, there should be regulations that not any rich person, rich organization should be the first in exploiting it.
Okay, so to recap just what I've understood you say is that the first opportunity gap that we have is recognizing that nature in itself is one that we must respect, one that we must work with our current ecological ecosystems to sustain it. The second point you brought out was around the laws that regulate this in terms of our constitution and the policies that are in place. And now that you mentioned policies, Dr. Celestine, I think one of the areas that you are really strong at is in looking at what our law states, where the gap is or where the disconnect is between what the law states and what that means to us as citizens. Most recently, one of the things cited was the uproar from the public in terms of food prices soaring, especially post-COVID, and now as a result of the Ukrainian war and how oil has affected almost the price of every commodity. How does that link back to food security for us? Where are these gaps? Where is it that the policies and the laws are failing us? Where is it that our responsible stakeholders are not taking up responsibility to ensure that its citizens are food secure?
Well, I don't think we did much more beyond declaring constitutional right to food in 2010, Article 43, 1C. Since then, I don't think we've done anything else other than simply declare that Kenyans have a right to be free from hunger and to have food that is adequate and of acceptable quality. That's all that we've done. So you look at the kinds of responses. So we don't really have, if you might say, a law on food security. No, we don't. As far as I'm aware, there was a bill that was brought before Senate, I believe in 2017, sponsored by the former Senator Kipchumba Murkomen, who was a former colleague of mine at the university. I am yet to engage with it fully because I only became aware of it quite recently. But what I would like to do is to compare it with the, say, India's Food Security Act, yeah, which was passed in 2013. I know from the India team that we were working with, many of them were involved in the campaign that led to the enactment of that law. But basically where you have food programs become not simply a discretionary agenda by MPs and bureaucrats, but that actually when there's a commitment to set up a food distribution system, for example, the entitlement of every child to a meal at school, then that becomes a legal entitlement, and there's a whole legislative framework to go with it, and then attached to that, whatever bureaucracy needs to be set up to oversee it, and some kind of accountability mechanism. So you basically trace it all the way from declaring the right to actually making sure it gets delivered, and that there's a remedy when it's not fulfilled. Okay, so we haven't got that. So what I'd like to do is do that comparison. That was supposed to be the next stage of the work. But I must say there's a gap in my research agenda. Soon after we finished the study, I left the country for a while, did other things, and now I'm coming back and saying, okay, where has it moved to? And I see that there's that yawning gap that we need to look at, yeah. But we also interrogated what kinds of responses the government made to the food price crisis of 2008 and then 2011. Those are the main spike periods in the global food price crisis that then translated into a local crisis here that went on even when the food prices had improved globally. Ours was still quite high, and we have a whole graph to show that when we did the study. What kinds of responses did we have? We only had very sporadic responses. One, I don't know if anyone remembers, there was some unga that was specially packaged in a 5 kg bag that was supposed to be made available in some selected places so that people who were on low incomes could buy it at a subsidized price. I think that lasted maybe 3 months at most. And you were lucky if you even caught sight of it, right? I mean, even the narrative in Mathare was that you could queue for hours and only a few would get it, then you'd be told, oh, imeisha, and then you have to go, okay? I believe that happened in two different episodes. Now, come to 2022, didn't we have the same thing? Was it early 2022 or late 2021? There was some announcement that on certain brands of unga, if you find it, it would be selling at half the price, at 100 as opposed to the 220, whatever the price that had hit. I never saw it, and I believe I looked in the right places, but never saw it. And I'm yet to meet anyone who actually did get that subsidized unga. So, I mean, we just respond when we have to. When the crisis seems now unbearable, that's when we respond. And it does confirm what a member of parliament who interviewed then told us, that look, we have a government that will respond if Kibera is burning. Okay, if we get as bad as that, yes, there'll be a response. But there isn't that institutionalized mechanism for responding. The other thing that might be described as slightly long-term, maybe, is the fertilizer subsidy. Again, that was a big announcement that was made soon after the election, the fertilizer subsidy. We had very many critical views about that, especially from the marginal areas like Ikuda. I mean, think about producers of maize who are not large-scale producers, okay? Actually, anyone who farms less than 10 acres or so is actually a net buyer of maize rather than a net producer. A fertilizer subsidy only benefits the net producers. So really only the large-scale producers will benefit, right? But we have no mechanism for making it so that that is not the only response that we have. Why don't we have responses that are tailored to the food security strategic advantages of each area, okay? So for Ikuda, the feedback was, how about a subsidy on irrigation equipment? Because what we are short on is the rainfall, okay? Our soil is good and all that. So why don't you have targeted interventions for Dr. Roba, for the pastoralist region, It may be a different kind of intervention, like livestock insurance. Why can't you have targeted interventions rather than this one-size-fits-all, which only benefits the net producers of only certain crops, like maize, okay, not even all the net producers of all other kinds of crops. But because we don't have an accountability mechanism, there isn't a place to ask these questions on a sustained basis.
When we look at the food protest situation as a nation, is there a link between the food protests and the political economy? Is there any relationship between that? And do those protests actually affect the access to food or the price of food or any essential commodity? Dr. Hassan and Dr. Mainge, I'm curious to know what your thoughts are.
Thank you. I think we need to first differentiate two very important terms. Food security, which means having access to good quantity of food and reliable source of food, which means any type of food. But there is another very important term that I think it's becoming now very important, especially the light of now GMOs are talking about food sovereignty, which is food sovereignty is the right of people to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods for their own consumption. So if you are food secure, which means if we supply as much food as possible through market process, then that's one thing. But are we able to produce our own food and eat food that we think are also culturally appropriate to us? And over the years, the push has been towards quantity. So produce as much as possible, mostly to meet market demand, but not look at the quality. Now with all these diet-related diseases, with now market capture, that people are now depending on external provision, they are not able to produce their own food, then we are in a serious debate about when do we lose our sovereignty, our ability to produce our own food in the way we can be safer from being manipulated or controlled by external market. Market is very unfair sometimes. And scarcity can be also created to look at demand and supply relationship. And you can see the price that has skyrocketed sometimes is manipulated because the producers want better market. And therefore people can die of hunger, not because the food is not there, but because of manipulation of location of food, transportation, basically. So we are insecure, but also we don't have right to the right food we want. So those two things are very important to see as a country, Kenya now. We are both food insecure. Even if we want to eat anything we come by, we don't get it. But also eating the quality of food that is good for our health, for our culture, for our life. We are also very far from that. We are completely trapped as a country. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hassan. So with your permission, we ditch food protests. We work towards food sovereignty that's grown ethically, that's indigenous to our culture, that's good for our bodies. Okay, yep. Thank you. Dr. Mainge?
Thank you, Dr. Hassan. It's a very emotive subject for me that so many centuries, decades later, that we are still talking about being food insecure and it being the subject that drives a lot of conversations. Really, we should be talking about food sovereignty. And right here in this region, Rwanda in particular has moved very many hurdles, whether it's legal, international legal instruments, to just rely on quality seeds to have food sufficiency and therefore sovereignty over its maize production. And in 2024, they're going to be sovereign over wheat production. So food sovereignty is actually a step higher. It says that you have given yourself the control over food, how you produce it, when you grow it, how you grow it, where you sell it. But if you're exposing yourself to market forces of supply and demand, politics are about to come in. And you have ships that are right at the port when people are crying, oh, there's no food. You're told it's coming from Mexico, and in 4 days' time, it's here. I think there's a lot of politics in what we are saying, and it reminds me, lastly, of the story that we've had, and I think it was in the press, that the man leaves the house in the morning. There's a whole debe, a whole big tin, 20 kilogram of ground maize flour, and he puts a signature on top and says nobody should touch it until I'm here. So that family is food secure? Not sure. Do they have sovereignty? Do they have the independence? And I think a number of boys have been beaten almost to death, and I think sometimes death, whereas there's food, but they've done it without permission. And that is what we're doing as a country, and I think it's a dangerous place.
Thank you, Dr. Ari, for what you've done. I think for me, as we proceed in this conversation, one of the issues that is key is understanding what is policy. Because if we were to understand what is that policy and the way it has been conceptualized, then we are able to come in with interventions that are important. What I'm looking at currently is the issue of policy alignment and coordination. In fact, I was talking to my friend here when I came in. I was asking, so do you understand where you work? He told me he works in Kiamba constituency. Then I was asking, what are the kind of policies that impact the operations of your business? And then he was open and he told me, by the way, I don't understand what, the connection. So as we continue with this conversation, one of the most important parts of it is to understand this conceptualization. Because I think one of the issues that has been is that we are addressing issues from different conceptual understanding. So if we are talking about food security, Dr. Ari has talked about food security in terms of livestock. If we go to Kiambu and these other central areas, we are talking about different kind of food security. So understanding the ecological, agroecological zones of the country, then we'll be able to come up with the interventions and initiatives that are directly to them. So, like when you talk about the policy right now, I was asking, I wrote by the way, Dr. Ari, there is a bill called the Food Security Bill 2014. There was one which was introduced in 2017. And then there are around other policies that have been put in place. But I think the problem has been, and the challenge that we have right now, is that those policies are not coordinated, so we are not going to achieve what we are looking for. So as we continue with the debate, and I want to urge all of us, that as we talk about food security, let's remember we are talking about sustainable food security. If we understand that, and then we have the same definition of what we are talking about, then it'd be easy for us to come up with initiative and solutions to our challenges. I think I will leave it there, and we can have more. I have written so much about food security. I've studied the question of food policies in Kenya, and I think we are working together, and the reason why I came here is I want to understand what people have, what people understand about sustainable food security, and what are the processes that we can put in place to ensure that we have food security from the local level to the national level to the regional and to the global. Thank you very much. And I think we have the issues, but the processes that we have taken to address the challenges that come with it are not aligned, and that's why we are continuing to have the challenges.
What's the end point? What's the goal? What's the goal of all these policies, of all these meetings that we have monthly, the reports we write, the researches we write? Like, make it make sense. Because first of all, just to begin, is that I find it nonsensical to blame Ukraine for the shortages of food, yet they are the ones who are supplying us with wheat the other day. It doesn't make sense, so make it make sense how we are blaming Ukraine. Secondly, the issue about food security and food sovereignty. These, as much as they're different, they're also interlinked. from where I come from, Elgeyo Marakwet, a few years back, how we used to do things was that once you harvest, you keep a full bag of maize for every child in the household, so that this bag runs for the whole year. So if you are 10 people in the house, you have 10 bags that should be in the store for the whole year. That is food security, or food sovereignty. Okay, actually food security. But with our culture, whereby when you have sons or daughters, once you become of age, they want farms. So you have a family of 10, they have 5 sons, they have an acre of land, they subdivide. So you lose the food security at the end of the day. Food sovereignty then comes in. How will we be food sovereign if we do not have the lands to grow our crops? So we tend to rely on other people like Ukraine. Our land tenure system is very funny because now we have freeholds as compared to leaseholds. We have freeholds whereby people can use their lands the way they want. It is enshrined in the Constitution. But at the end of the day, there is an effect whereby we do not get arable land where we can plant these crops in large scale, the way England and the US do, so that we have subsidized farming. We can also target these farmers with subsidized, fertilizers. For example, the fertilizer that was given to Bomet and Kericho County for the tea production, because they have specialized in tea. There's no maize in Bomet. Okay, there is, but it's in low qualities, and they depend on counties like Trans Nzoia to supply them with maize. So there's that interdependency. We cannot expect Dr. Hassan to tell us that they're going to get an irrigation scheme in Mandera to plant whatever they want to plant. And we know very well that climate change is now a real thing, of which still I want you to make it make sense, because the country is selling carbon credits to other polluters. It doesn't make sense. Whatever we are doing does not make sense at the end of the day. We might be here the whole day, we might be here the whole year, coming up with policies, but unless we address our land tenure systems where we have specialized farming, we'll keep on talking, we'll keep on bringing bills to parliament, we'll keep on meeting and having tea, but nothing is going to happen. Nothing is going to happen. There's no goal unless you have a goal. So unless you make it make sense, then we can start talking.
I read somewhere, and this I'd like to assume are your own words. But before I get to the words, it goes back to the last statement you said, and I think Dr. Hassan also mentioned it, around market demand and supply, around the control of food pricing. And we all know the source of food production is either through the seed or it's in livestock husbandry. And the statement I'm about to read states, "He who controls the food controls the people, but he who controls the seed controls the food system." So how then do we put the seed back into the hands of the farmer? So maybe if you're at liberty to share with the audience why that statement, what it means to you, why it was necessary to be stated, but also how then do we put the seeds back into the hands of the farmer with that statement as a premise?
Thank you, Maureen. I think it's kind of twisted around, because the foundation is the seed. So if you have seed, even in all the religious books, you're given seed for food. And living seed is therefore a means to livelihoods and life. And so if somebody takes control of seed in a legislative manner or hoarding or whatever way, then you're actually controlling the right of the people to food, and therefore you're free to dictate prices, you're free to withdraw it. And in many of the new legislations, and actually the commercialization of seeds, they always write back that the company, on the bottom, that the company does not have an obligation to supply it all the time. In other words, they can withdraw it, just like the way when you walk into a bazaar, when you buy it, you cannot return it, right? But there's also another writing that says that I am providing the seeds now, but I have no obligation to provide it next year, if that is the only solution and means to life and to your food. And talking about seeds in particular, we've seen the wonderful introduction of BT cotton in 2019, there was a lot of subsidies that we are talking about, and people were so happy about how it was performing and that they had a new means of livelihood, a new means of production, and therefore ultimately to food. So it went on that season, it was good, but right now in 2022 we are hearing and we are documenting a lot of misgivings. Because in 2012, the Mutudho Commission on Agriculture passed another bill that says that seeds and patenting, not patenting, breeder protection on seeds is a big thing here in Kenya. And so previously, a lot of the farmers in Western Kenya and Tana River and everywhere used to know that once you grow cotton and you ship it to the ginnery, then they pay you for the cotton and they give you your seed back. You could replant it. That's going against the new law that the seed is owned by a certain corporation, and that corporation demands you to go back to the market and buy the seed. And so our poor cotton farmers are making noises and saying, oh, the government has not come in to give us seed, because you get into a dependency situation, and that whole thing of where you used to depend on your own sustainable means of getting seed is now being curtailed by the 2020 Seed Act that says seed is rented for one season. You're not free to replant it. You certainly must not share it. You must not keep it. You must not give it to another one, because then you're actually destroying somebody else's market. And so when the farmers are waiting for their seed to be given back, like the old times, they're missing it. And so it's the same thing with even the tools that we're using for food production. Maize, beans, so long as they're hybrid and somebody has invested technology in it, then replanting it, keeping it, sharing it is actually breaching the intellectual property that is in the seed. And so if you do commercial seeds, then we agree with the government that the person should pay every season. And so the question of sustainability is there. But if we did go back now to indigenous seeds that are diverse, well adapted to the local condition and resilient, those farmers always keep their seeds, and we are asking that the government needs to come in and invest a lot of money to keep the seed free from degenerative diseases like viruses, nanini, but the seed is free within the ownership of the commons. And I think any much further, I'd like to leave it to the learned friends. I'm not a learned friend, so I cannot call her my learned friend.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yes, so the ownership is where the control comes in. And so please understand that when you buy your seed from the agrovet, it's not yours. You promise to rent it for one season, produce your food, eat it, sell it, but not replant that seed. You have to go back to the seed, to the agrovet and buy. That's what the law is. And alternatively, we are trying to come up with a farmer-managed seed system where indigenous populations of seeds are actually being multiplied with science, the latest science, because population genetics is so diverse and so complicated, but the ownership of that seed is to the commons, the community, through community seed banks, not where an individual owns it and therefore amasses all the wealth to themselves because they're breeder protecting the seed for the next 20 years or 25.
Dr. Celestine, before you support or add on to what Dr. Menge is saying, I just need to understand something. I'm not a cotton farmer, so I will not sit here and pretend to understand what you mean by BTM for cotton. BT, yeah. No worries. And then the other thing, if I hear you correctly, so if I'm a cotton farmer and I take my cotton to the ginnery, of course, there's the seed that's extracted and it can be replanted. but I'm not allowed to replant it, and I'm not allowed to share it with any other farmer. So if I need to grow a new crop, I have to go back and buy new seed. So what happens to the seed that came with the previous harvest? Is it banked somewhere? What happens to that seed? I mean, we don't need to answer that right now, but I was just curious about that.
Very quickly.
Yeah, please go ahead.
The seed that is retained, actually 60% of the cotton yield, 60% goes to food. And so you may say that we have a BT crop and it's allowed for commercialization for textiles. But a lot of it comes back as cotton oil, cotton cake, cotton for feeding human populations. And there's no direct exposure, and I think I'll have an opportunity to talk about the food chains because there's a degree of separation. But we can talk about it.
Thank you so much.
Well, I'm not learned in matters of seed. I have tried my hand at agriculture. I'm very new to it. It's actually mainly my husband who's the enthusiast, so I just support. But I think the reason why we have policy conversations, so even a law like that is not written in stone. We can observe after several years and decide that now this one needs to be reopened for a policy discussion again. They're not set in stone, okay, thankfully. So if it's having such disastrous effects, it does definitely needs to be discussed again. Well, Mr. Kemboy, Oliver, for a lawyer, you have very little faith in what policy discussions and legal discussions are for. I mean, how are we going to shape the future direction of matters like what Dr. Wangi is talking about if we don't sit here and talk? And even if we say let's not have the tea, we still must talk, okay? So we might as well have the tea while we do it, okay? Now, on the question of land tenure, I can't give a comprehensive answer, but I don't think that having freehold is in itself a problem. You seem to suggest that the problem is in freehold. Or maybe I misunderstood you. But one thing that I did get is that now when we have subdivisions, which we somehow believe that when you're inheriting land from your father, let's be honest, it's mostly fathers who are holding the titles, because from my research, we have less than 5% of titles registered in women's names, okay? So we seem to think that it must physically be divided, okay? So that if you have 10 sons, now you'll find that that land holding has become like 10 little parcels. And then what you can do with it is really greatly diminished. And yet we have things in law like tenancy in common. When you're tenants in common, you have each, undivided shares. So it's not the physical land that is the property. The property is in your understanding of what your entitlement is. So you know, in this 30-acre piece of land, my share is, a quarter of that. And you don't have to physically go and show somebody, this is it here. So that way, then you can still farm it collectively, maximize on, what do the economists call it, economies of scale, right? And still get your 1/4 benefit from it without losing anything. But so maybe you need to go back to Elgeyo Marakwet and educate your cousins, and say, look, we don't have to physically go there with ropes and measure and subdivide the land. We can still get the benefit of it and still be secure in our entitlement. Because really tenure security is more a state of mind, okay? And then it's backed up by state guarantees in the paper titles that we have. But really, unless people have that faith, we'll continue behaving like Kenyans and putting up high walls and putting up signs, this land is not for sale. You're not satisfied that you have your title, you must still, and then you employ a guard to guard an empty plot that has nothing in it, just because you don't trust that everyone else recognizes your right to it. I think that's where the problem is. Yeah.
I'd like to direct the next question to Dr. Hassan, for him to share his thoughts around land tenure. And Dr. Hassan, in the same vein, I know you're very passionate about pastoral land use systems. And the other word that I asked you to hold on to was the word primitive. But I'll add more words to this conversation in terms of culture and how does that influence the land use systems, especially in the northern frontier. When we look at the neo-colonization of food production, what does that translate practically? I mean, we say kwa ground vitu ni different. So how does that, in your work experience and in your living environment, how does that translate practically? And then how do we also safeguard the community's rights and access to this pasture and water resources?
Thank you. And I just want also to give a bit of a comment on the seed question that farmers must continue to have access to seed because seeds are part and parcel of production. And there are a lot of crops and crop diversities that has come about because of farmers' choices, farmers' seed selections. We have crops that we call land races that are quite adapted to ecosystem because of continuous selection by farmers to adapt the seeds to a particular ecosystem. So taking the seeds away from farmers or the people who produce actually is a big problem. And the industrial seeds or commercial seeds is a big, big problem. And we must resist that, that as a country, we must continue our extension service. We must support farmers to still have ownership of the seeds. That's just as a by the way. The pasture system is a very complex system, and that's very highly characterized by a lot of local knowledge in terms of livestock management, range management, which includes mobility of herds to track pasture in space and time. So we call it a low external input system whereby we don't put fertilizer to grow grass. What you just need to do is to herd your cattle there. And what we are caring about just the tragedy of the commons that you don't put too much livestock on the rangeland. And this we know that there's traditional institutions, governance that helps pastoralists to regulate how much livestock they have. So the knowledge system has evolved over time in terms of breeding, selections, animals that adapted to the harsh environment, to water scarcity and mobility. But what's happening now, because of many, many other factors, external pressure, one, for example, loss of key grazing resources. In most of these areas, there's a lot of competition for land, for conservation, for example. All key grazing areas, the mountains, the water, the riverines have all been taken to conserve wildlife, for example. And there are people who believe wildlife has better return for households than livestock. Again, a big problem. Or other investments. The government want to put land for military purpose or for other purpose. So what happens, the traditional flexibility and mobility of people to track resources in time and space is completely constrained. Therefore, they are trapped into a small space that they cannot escape now. And when catastrophe comes, because the rain here is quite patchy, variability is high, more than 33% in terms of annual variability or seasonal variability. It can actually rain in one 10 meter by 10 kilometer by 10 kilometer, and then the next one is dry. Unless you allow people to move between these two spaces in time and space, you cannot move. Therefore, the practice of mobility to track resources is very important, but it has been constrained. Some, of course, is the people's own problem, where insecurity, inter-ethnic clashes that are necessary, that are there. But then the inter-ethnic clashes that we hear about northern Kenya is also not without external influence. The government has decided to create a lot of boundaries, administrative units, locations, sub-location chiefs. All this brings a lot of bad blood between communities. So the traditional reciprocity of sharing resources between communities, different seasons, has been curtailed completely. We are very political now. You cannot move to another region. So people are now trapped into a very unviable space. The rangeland is such a very unique ecosystem that you can only use its variability through resilience and movement. If you remove that, it becomes a hopeless space. So what we are trying to say, the customary land tenure rights, now that has been entrenched in the Constitution 2010, and now the Community Land Act is making it more practical. If this land is registered with communities, and community can plan for this land, and they can also plan grazing, they can also plan other utilization like conservation on their own accord, then we are free from external interference. But the government, again, is very slow in making this to happen. The law is there. Communities can reserve their land in theory, but in practice, for example, in northern Kenya, no single former trust land has been registered up to date. Communities are only able to convert what was traditionally called the group ranches that has some form of ownership of group members to community land. But the bulk of land in northern Kenya and all these big counties that has been traditionally under trust or held by the counties as a trust is not been registered almost 5 years or 6 years now. after the law came into effect. And you ask why? No reason. There's a law. And for us, we know. We know because the government is interested in appropriating this land for other mega projects. There's lapses coming. If the community have the land registered, the government has to pay the community. Now the land is free. They don't pay. Just take the land because it's communal land. So the government is very slow, deliberately, to take as much land as possible, so that by the time the land is registered, there's nothing left for the community to own. This is something we are trying to argue, and as the government, please fast-track registration of the land so that communities can have their own regulations, their own engagement, negotiation, inter-community negotiation. Stakeholder or investors can come and ask for space, and community can engage them in their own terms. This, if it happens, it will be a big solution to food sovereignty problem or food security problem in long term. But currently, it's a big problem. So for us, if you ask the priority for this region, to our leaders, to policymakers, to all other people, the solution to food security problem in northern Kenya is communities to have secure tenure rights so that they can manage their land and organize their production within the other external challenges like climate change.
How in your explanation, you've actually elaborated the food sovereignty that you're talking about, where one, ownership and access to the land, and you've said in your area, there's increasing pressure on ownership of land in the region, but the pressure is external. The land is not being owned by the community, meaning they have no sovereignty over the decisions that affect the land.
And my question is, genetic use restriction technology. It's actually something which is quite rife. Today I attended a press conference of a certain group of farmers calling themselves Association of Biotechnology Farmers or something of the sort. And what they're actually advocating for this BT maize. But with this genetic use restriction technology, what's the future of indigenous seeds? Because that is something which will end. And what is the future of perhaps the ecosystem within where we plant these particular seeds? And perhaps also, question number 3, what does it mean for the sovereignty of food? Thank you.
As human rights defenders, what should we do to root out corruption in Ministry of Agriculture, corruption in every sector that deals with food? Because we know Buragalole, Waligula, and so many others which I can't mention.
My question is, I've just been looking at that graphic there. There is a man lying on the ground begging for something, begging for food in that light. And there seemed to be someone who is behind and someone who is in front. Then I believe the answer that they are giving to this seemingly malnourished person, they are telling him, you want food? Then you're hungry. GMO is a solution. Now, I want to pose this question to all of us. Is it really the responsibility of the government to ensure the right to food? The right to food falls under the socioeconomic right. Short and sweet, I'm trying to do that. It falls under the socioeconomic right. And I believe it's one of the rights that is not absolute, meaning it's limited. And that's why sometimes these bills, they go into parliament, the government actually does not really work on them because it's not an absolute right. Actually, when you read that Article 43 says, the government will. It's not a must. Is it really a responsibility of the government? I believe, I'm not trying to answer, I need that answer clarified, yes. But I believe also it traces to each and every individual. Thank you.
I just want to appreciate the conversations and discussions. You know, we're moving from food security now to understanding food sovereignty. I just want to appreciate, you know, because that's the changing context that we're living in. And just to respond to the young lawyer, I'm sorry I didn't catch your name. It is the responsibility of the government to fulfill human rights, and right to food is one of the rights. The obligations of the state are to protect, respect, and fulfill human rights. The right to food is under Article 43, that every person has the right to be free from hunger and to have adequate food of acceptable quality. That's in Article 43, and Article 21 of our Constitution is also on the role of the state in implementing human rights, right to food being one of them. So I believe that the state has a responsibility, has an obligation to ensure that every person has access to food. And I think for us, like Oliver asked, it doesn't make sense that we are still dealing with these same issues, and they seem to be getting worse with no new solutions, or interventions being put in place. I like what Dr. Musembi alluded to, the Right to Food Act in India. It's really an incredible act, and it took 11 years to pass that act. In September, I had the chance to travel to India, and we interacted with some who are in that campaign, and even people who benefit from that law. And it's mainly welfare-based, and it covers about 75% of the population. It's really incredible knowing the population of India, covering 75% of their population. It is publicly financed with like 0.5% of their GDP. Maybe we are not there as Kenya, but we need to institutionalize this right. We need, like in India, they have institutionalized it such that if there is any complaints, any grievances, by law, state officials can be called to account. And I think where we are now, aside from policies, we need to have a law where we can hold, so we can have somebody who can be held accountable, a department, a ministry, a person who can be held responsible for one person dying or people going hungry in Kenya. So with the Right to Food Coalition, we are working on a bill. We've done some research on the 2014 bill, the 2017. So they were passed in Senate and then referred to National Assembly. At National Assembly, they were labeled a money bill, which is a bill with budgetary implications, and that's where it stopped. I've not been able to find anything going on with them. So we've banded together as civil society, and we want to develop a bill, make it as consultative, as inclusive as possible, bring the issues that Dr. Hassan is talking about in this bill, because right to food touches on many sectors, not just agriculture, not just production. But we want the support. So if you're interested in this room, that is our work, and we'll be happy to bring you in.
I would like to ask Dr. Hassan, what is happening on the ground? Because these people, we've seen on television that they let the food die. Clearly, they would be secured if they maybe eat the cows instead of them just dying. And yeah, so that's one question. The second question is, we are discussing policies, we are having this conversation, there's a bill that she's talking about. So what is next after this? Is it that we are just doing this, then all of them is just rights on paper? What happens next?
Hybrids are a wonderful tool in modern agricultural science, and it contributed a lot to the Africa Green Revolution, any green revolution anywhere, hybrids. Unfortunately, it is also the start of where commodification of natural resources started from, and for people to amass a lot of wealth if you own a hybrid. And I said that hybrids are very good. They are meant to use three things intensively: lots of water, fertilizer, and pesticides. And so in the context of sustainable agriculture, if the farmer is always looking to their pocket to buy pesticides and the fertilizer and all that, it's good. And I think it drives the conversation of looking only at yield increases, never at taste, never at what other diversity is there for people to eat. And so we've had food, including maize or cabbages, that will look very big, very wonderful, but they've been benefiting from a lot of water, a lot of fertilizer, and they're usually tasteless, and the nutrient content is lagging. It's one of the things that went further ahead in the 1980s when they put in a legal precedent. My legal lawyers can help me. When the first time they agreed that the law can agree to patenting of life forms. So some Indian professor out somewhere in the US found a bacteria that could eat oils. And he went to court, and it was made that that was his discovery. And since that time, we've seen the increase in intellectual property rights and breeder protection of everything. And we've forgotten something else. As a breeder and as a molecular breeder, I do know for sure that if you were to concentrate your effort in open pollinated varieties, indigenous varieties, some of them really do very well with low input requirements. And so in terms of sustainability, diversity wins the day. In terms of making people rich, and I say let's go for it, go for hybrids. And so we want scientists. In fact, I've been looking for Professor Anami and any of the science professors in this college, these universities in Kenya, to help us work with local farmers to improve their scientific knowledge and input in knowledge co-creation. When you come up with a population that is very good for any niche, has it had an input of somebody who can do those things that we used to call the Handy-Weinberg equation? It's an instant equation, don't bother about it. But it's where now they have the right to come in and say, my grandmother who selected and advanced varieties and kept saying, this is good, and I'm watching it over season to see how it's adapting. I call her as a useless what? Yet me with a PhD in this area, I'm the only one breeder who is allowed to own and patent or breeder protect varieties. That's really a big problem. Then the other area of gut restriction technologies, and I thank Professor Nami for doing it, there is a moratorium for quite a while now, and a few of these multinational business companies were stopped from using that one to amass wealth and to keep others from accessing it. And really, it's not needed anymore because we have new tools, they call them tools, such as gene drives. If I want my technology to dominate in any population and be the only one that stands, I use a gene drive, and it's going to dominate, and yours will die out in the way. There are so many things that are going in, and right now, all I can say is that the whole area of digital sequence information and the way it's being used, the way we are arguing about it at the UN level, we are at a disadvantage as a developing country, whether we are medium or low. But all these big countries have very advanced scientists, and they don't need now to do biopiracy. They steal one and sequence it and go there and make all the toxins, poisons, proteins that would help them without ever coming back to us. And I tell you, the knowledge, the growth in science, including digital technologies, is so advanced that I'm afraid that KU, Jomo Kenyatta, Nairobi, you need to pull up your socks. Don't do technologies that were done back in 1996. We are in 2023. Please match up for our sovereignty and don't allow where others are dominating the speech, are dominating the science. We have a right to protect it because genetic resources are actually protected in Article 11 of the Constitution as the heritage, the common heritage of us all.
I haven't really been part of the GMO conversation, but I hear something of a worrying message from my colleague here, that having a moratorium shouldn't give us any comfort because we are still getting hit, even with the moratorium still there, because there are other ways in which they can still, work our own local varieties into extinction, something like that. That I seem to have had a less optimistic message from what you had. But anyway, I'm not really in that area. Maybe I will. If it's simplified enough, I might just get involved in it. If you can't work in food security and not take interest in these things, so I guess I will have to. I think I'll only respond to maybe 3 questions. One, how do we deal with corruption in the sectors dealing with food? The way we should deal with corruption in any sector, the way we should deal with any crime. I mean, investigate and prosecute. I don't know why we keep going around in circles. It's that needs to happen. Investigate and prosecute. So why is it we can't master the willpower to do it? There's no rocket science to it. Yeah. Then your question, the lawyer here. Why are lawyers so interested in this? That right to food is not an absolute right. Which right is absolute? There isn't. All rights have restrictions. Yes, we have some non-derogable rights. Rights that can't be suspended even in a national emergency, like right to life, etc. But there is no such thing as an absolute right. We have restrictions on all rights. I'll start with property rights, for example. And I'll tell you why you can't walk into my home and demand dinner, okay? and why I can't put up a shop and say, I'll only sell to my fellow Kambas. Anyone else can't come. I've already put my property out in the public space, so I've lost my right to exclude, or rather, I've accepted some restrictions on my right to exclude. So the idea that socio-economic rights are somehow not absolute and the others are, get rid of that idea, okay? So in terms of understanding state obligation, I think she made she gave the breakdown that everyone who's in human rights law knows about. The layout of the state obligations, the obligation to respect rights, meaning the state basically gives you the space, yeah, like with food, gives you the space to produce your own food in dignity, etc. The obligation to protect, meaning that the state protects you from interference by others. So that's why we have consumer protection laws to ensure food safety, etc. And then the obligation to fulfill. Okay, so it may come down to actual provision in situations of a crisis where people are unable to produce their own food. So there's a whole range, and you can see that as we describe each level, it's not just the state acting. I am acting too. And by the way, our constitution also has horizontal application, you know that, where every person has an obligation to respect the Bill of Rights. So it's not just a very simple idea of state providing food, okay? And that's the idea that we're debunking even in Mathare, right? They themselves were self-critical of people who didn't think of the right to food as anything more than simply give me food when I'm hungry, okay? And then, of course, the phrase, even in international human rights law, that when a state's obligation in the area of social and economic rights is always worded in terms of to the maximum of its available resources. So we may not have as big a budget on agriculture as, say, the US or Germany, but within our available resources, are we doing the best we can? Yeah, so there's a contextual assessment, yeah, that we can do, okay? I think finally the comments of Jerry, I didn't get your last name, Kararu or something. I'll look you up later. Yeah, I think I'll want to hear more on the update on the food security bills and then how to revive that conversation.
So generally we have had almost now 3-year or 4-year rain failure or below average performance of rainfall. And this has led to loss of big number of livestock over the last 2-3 years. And this is the worst time, I think this is the worst drought that we have experienced now for the last decades. And this is closely associated with climate change and other bigger external factors happening. As usual, the government is trying to intervene now, a bit too little, too late, where they're trying to provide relief food, supporting households with food ration, which most of us feel is unfortunate, because if the government has sort of used the same resource to support offtake before the drought will affect the livestock, then we would have saved a lot of livestock and households can still supply. Not forgetting that although pastoralism is highly informed by cultural practices and knowledge of the pastoralist, is also a very much economical endeavor. People use their livestock to buy their food because they are fully now market integrated. people buy food from shops and they use livestock, the milk, or they sell livestock to buy. They pay school fees, selling livestock every other season. So when they lose this number of livestock, now they are completely impoverished. Not just the food, but also all the other economic practices are completely curtailed. So this is a big, big loss. And we hope this time we'll learn again, because this drought is bound to come back. Now we are getting some rain showers here and there. But for the government, we need really serious policy that sort of help people to go through hard time like this, so that we don't wait for rations or for relief, which is becoming too late. And also it dehumanizes people, begging for support, that people are dying. It's not really what we expect during this, at this time in many years of independence. So that we must have good policies that sort of pumps resources to here, so that people can proudly sell their livestock when there's indication of drought. Then we have departments or government agencies like a National Drought Monitoring Authority that naturally is there to help people to predict rainfall pattern, and also says where there's alert or there's problem now with the coming drought. Such responses can be used to help people to sell their livestock. And then there was some effort towards providing insurance for pastoralists, that when the rainfall is beyond or below certain ratios, certain level, then people can insure some of their livestock. Those are some of the policies that we need to encourage, that people can only keep as much livestock as they can insure. So then they lose drought, they can be also compensated just like other crop failures. So we have indication of good policies in places, but they are not functioning. We need to tighten a bit of that, so that in the future, we are not repeating the same mistake that we are doing now, we are talking about people losing life because of famine. This is unfortunate and should not happen at this time in our history.
To recap what you've said, livestock is currency. So it's not just about the culture, it's the currency that's used for different needs, whether it's paying fees, whether it's access to healthcare. The livestock is currency. There's opportunity to learn from previous mistakes where we're not repeatedly making the same mistakes. And then there's a de-link between having policy and practical application on the ground.
Mine is mostly alluded to Dr. Hassan, especially when he talked about land tenure, and I want to interlink it with climate change. So one of the conversations that and supposed outcome of the Conference of Parties in Egypt this year was the adoption of something they termed as 30 by 30. That is to have 30% of the global landmass to be under protection by the year 2030. And I wanted to understand, or rather get his input on how that affects food security and food sovereignty. Thank you. 30% of landmass protected, yes, protected by 2030. Thank you.
I grew up in a community where there was plenty of food, and the stores would fill with maize and beans, and sometimes we would even lack some places to put the foods. And I also grew up knowing that Moi would give us some milk. I tasted Moi milk early in my primary school. And Kibaki brought roads, and Uhuru brought projects. And now we have the Hustler funds. And I am worried because we are getting away from our quality, safe foods with all the technologies and the English, much English, and a lot of things. We are getting away and we are getting sick. Gas is there, cancer is there, asas, I don't know. I miss my githeri back there home. So my question is very simple. Do we have hope of getting back to safe and quality foods in our counties in Kenya?
My interest in food is mainly around food markets. And the two major failures I see in terms of food markets is, number one, the fact that we are experiencing food insecurity. Yet, before we started, there was a presentation going on, and one major thing that came up was the fact that there is a third or 33% of our food is wasted every year. And so how do we have a situation where we have both food insecurity and also food waste? And is that an indication of food market failures? And how can we improve on that and make markets efficient? And also hand in hand with that is food quality. So not only do we demand to have enough food, but food of quality, because we operate in a capitalistic system, and the main objective of capitalism is basically to make profits for the corporations. And so how do we balance, or how can the government step in to ensure that the food is not adulterated and that it's of good quality?
Now my question, even though I think she touched on it, is just to explain, especially to the panelists, as well as our colleagues here, that what are your honest opinions when it comes to GMO? Is it a yes or a no for it? And what does that mean again for food sovereignty? And lastly, is GMO the last resort for our country? Because when you speak to people, they talk about other areas like Trans Nzoia producing food and themselves asking for the government to come and pick that food and take it to the people who are suffering. But it is easier said than done.
GMO, how I understand it, is just a translation of AI, yeah, in the tech world. And AI is a big threat to some professions. In my office, I work as a digital investigator, so technically I deal with a lot of digital investigations, so I am more into the AI world than this traditional journalism. So my question is GMO a threat to the agricultural ecosystem for our farmers, and should they feel threatened for their food in the market? Since, you know, I mean, I've already described it's like AI in the tech world. Should they be worried for their products? And also, as she said, will the agricultural ecosystem be, you know, messed up in a way? Yeah.
So the question by Sharon on failure of food markets and systems is very interesting, because when we talk about the ability to feed the country, the people sustainably, we are talking about many things, and some of them are structural, policy, politics, and everything. In terms of the genetics, we've actually changed the material so much that maize, which never used to decay in the shamba, in the field, is actually now doing it. The tester and the seed is so soft that it's being attacked by weevils right at in the field before you even put it in the granary store. And of course, we've seen the question of aflatoxin everywhere, including where millers, national millers, are being warned, and it's been in the national press that, oh, Unga Limited and Pembe, your grain and Unga in the superstores is full of aflatoxin. What can you do? That's KEBS that has come in to say all this. So that's quality, but it's also creating shortages and waste. And that is a very convoluted question, needing a convoluted answer. I think all I can tell you is balancing and looking for lack of, for not adulteration is a big question. Because when you move away from where you're in control of the food to where you put the food in somebody else to supply you, whatever they do with it, whether it's your milk or not, at the end of the day, if the cow is yours and you're the one that saw it being milked, you can trust that milk. And to tell you what else is going on, I like talking about sorghum. Here we call it the poor man's crop, and if I went through the audience and asked you, when did you eat sorghum last? We are going to find some young people that have never even put sorghum in their mouth. It's called the poor man's crop. There are efforts to do genetic modification, very unfortunate, but let's have it because we are all trying to answer the question of food shortages. But what I can tell you right now, not quinoa, not fonio, not chia, the Americans are always looking for healthy food diets. And in 2020, when the COVID came around, they discovered suddenly that sorghum is 15 to 20 times better than fonio, quinoa, chia, and others. And actually, when they grow it, they discovered it doesn't need so much fertilization, so much pesticides, not even much irrigation. And right now, it's called the camo crop. Here, we call it the poor man's crop. Nobody wants to eat it. But there, right now, as we speak, America is the #1 producer of sorghum, and the consumer and exporter. They're exporting huge volumes to EU in the alternative section. When they are not wanting GMOs, the sorghum is the first choice. They are doing it in Japan and China, but because the populations and the demand to feed animals is so much, there's not enough sorghum. Why can't the county governments and the policies here supply sorghum? Because sorghum, although you're not eating it, it is the center of diversity, the center of origin is this area, all the way to South Sudan, eastern Uganda, northern Kenya. And the genetic diversity is actually here, but now it's being profited from by the US. This is an opportunity we needed to put our students to do a lot of research and supply us food that we know. And the last thing is that in the US, the demand for own consumption is so high, even as a gluten-free, nutrient-dense food. That's why they're abandoning all these other things that we are looking for. And we need to change our mindsets. When you have drought, the drought is actually in our minds. So that question, just to finish that one of Nyakiraro. Once you got to the AI, a lot of us are still trying to understand what AI is, but I think we are not very far behind you. And this is a place where you can set up a lot of controversies, and I don't want to do that without science-based evidence. The only thing I know is that with molecular tools and genetic information technology going so far ahead, they already know what is there. There are some moratoriums and Convention of Biological Diversity rules that are saying when you do that, you're crossing a few areas. But in terms of threats to farmers and the markets, are you going to eat synthetic vanilla or the natural one that comes from plants? Because that is being driven by a lot of new genetic synthetic biology. There are so many other things that we can do it, but we are not at the forefront. Madagascar, Uganda have been the source of vanilla, but now it's being turned the way pyrethrum did. And they turned pyrethrum from the natural one that used to give a lot of livelihoods, means, and ways to live. And now synthetic pyrethrum is the leading way to do it. So the pyrethrum coming from natural is not anywhere there, and it's caused a lot of threat to the ecosystem and even our health, because we know that some of the synthetic pyrethrums that have come on board are actually causing a lot of genetic issues, reproduction issues, and the more you pollute the kind of agriculture that you're practicing, the more you're moving away from what is God-ordained natural means. But by all means, let's have choice. Let people go business as usual. But somebody else is making much more money than you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mange. Dr. Celestine?
Well, I think since my fellow panelist has answered quite extensively on a lot of the issues, I'll only make a comment on one. You asked whether we should worry about whether GMOs are a threat to farming. I don't know. I leave that to the people who are knowledgeable in that. But I'll tell you what my worry is. My worry is, do we have a legal and regulatory environment that is robust enough to give us assurance that we can trust this technology, right? Whether it's what we're eating, what we're growing, do we have the means to regulate it and actually give assurances for consumer protection? Yeah, that would be my worry.
If I understood well the question about the 30%, 30 by 30 initiative, whether it's feasible in this region. So the 30 by 30 is an initiative that says the global community has sort of have an objective or an initiative to have 30% of land mass protected as protected area by 2030. This is a good vision, of course. But for it to be workable, especially in this type of ecosystem, we have to resolve the existing challenges. For example, in Kenya and northern Kenya and Ireland, especially, the question of land tenure, on whose land will you do protection, has to be resolved. We have to appreciate that even with the existing model of conservation, that's very much borrowed from colonial time or fortress conservation system, the bulk of wildlife is still found on community land. So we are not very effective in our current conservation model that protects key ecosystem from people, because the wildlife don't know boundaries. So there's a lot of wildlife in community or people use landscape. This is natural, and most communities have lived very well with wildlife. The Maasai don't hunt, for example. So, but there are also efforts which are in place towards community conservation. A good effort though, but it's still not quite successful because it still borrows a lot from the traditional fortress protectionist position, which means we have to have scouts with guns to protect wildlife and separate. A truly people-driven conservation can be initiated, and it's probably also been tried elsewhere. So the 30 by 30 is possible and feasible if only we resolve the underlying land right, land tenure issues. And if, for example, in northern Kenya, we allow communities to have their land registered and then practice their own form of conservation on those lands, and then count those lands as a national contribution or part of our initiatives towards that global initiative, well and good. But what will not work is for the government to continue extending the current protected areas to community areas, take away land from people, and thereby causing more food insecurity to communities and the region. Because wildlife is good, but it never really support household to the effort that to the extent that their own livestock can help them, because they do, even in community conserved areas, they do what you call public goods, schools, school fees for a limited number of kids. But that does not account for opportunities that you lose as a pastoralist or a person who uses the land. So that is how I see that there will be some conflict here if we completely come and take out this land from people and put it in a protection area. Finally, on GMO, which is very hot cake, hot potato in Kenya now, I have my own reservation based on my own background in biodiversity. It is not good for Kenya. I feel we are not yet ripe for this, whatever. We need to borrow from developed economy, how they have dealt with GMOs and what type of problem now they're going to. We don't want to adversely affect our ecosystem functioning because we don't have still possible regulations that can address some of the things that will come up with, for example, pollinations of neighboring farms if we are going to grow GMO foods, health effects that people are still talking about. And have we exhausted all our natural potential as a country to produce our own food in the way that we produce? So that we now go to extra miles, say we need to feed. So, of course, this debate has been around for a long time. For example, there's this playwright, in German playwright, Bertolt Brecht, who, for example, proposed graph first, then ethics, which means food first, then talk about other values later. Are we ready to say food first, and as long as we are dying from hunger, we can eat anything? Or are we saying we can still work on our resilience as a country, our ecosystem as a country, and produce things within our own ecosystems naturally and feed ourselves? And if need be, at some later point, talk about GMOs because we're not able to meet our population. So other people are saying, because we have a lot of big population, as Malthus says, more people now need to eat, so we need to produce food in the whatever we can to just feed the population. These are all debates that we need to go on to as a country. So the removal of the ban on GMO, I think, is very untimely. We need to talk to ourselves more and give ourselves enough justification as a country to say, yes, we need it and we must address the food security. Even from northern Kenya, where we are suffering from famine and people dying, we are not ready for GMO. We want still to try our own indigenous economy. We want to try our agroecology. We want to try our exchange of seeds with our farmers on livestock breeding in our own way, not a shortcut to have food that we cannot know what is going to have, the effect it's going to have on our health or on our culture, on our values.
I know the topic around the GMO one is a hot topic, and it's also a very sensitive topic. Personally, I struggle to be for or against it because, again, I'm coming from a point of no knowledge, so I cannot speak on it. However, the last two people who are going to speak are my two learned friends, Dr. Maingi, who has stated that he would like to respond to the gentleman's question around, is it a yes or no? I don't think there's a yes or no answers, but we'll give Dr. Maingi a chance to speak on it. And then also to Professor Anami, who has just something to say. But I do request that we keep it very, very brief in the interest of time. On your question around the BT, Dr. Maingi, I think you can speak to the lady at the front at the end of the session. They have additional questions around the BT seed that you had talked about and the system around the seed and not being able to transfer it or sell it or replant it. I'll pass on the question to you and you can see them later. But for now, let's keep it brief on your response to the gentleman at the back, and then we'll give Professor Anami just a bit of time to respond to the GMO question.
Non-categorical terms say GMO yes or no. And I'm going to say yes, but I'm going to say no. Both. There are enough legal protections. There is a lot of, I've been involved from day one in the writing of the biosafety bill. If implemented properly, we have protections. But at the end of the day, I don't want us to be left in courts trying to argue whether the shoe was on the left side or on the right side, because you're undermining the rights of people to choose or not to choose. So if you find me starving, emaciated, please spoon feed me with GMOs for that day. In fact, infuse them into my system. Because I think aflatoxin will take me out, but overall as a country, please, there are so many wonderful technologies, including agroecology, and once you roll out GMOs, there's no space for agroecology.
This was our fifth food literacy forum. The last two forums were on climate change and food, and access to food or access to adequate food in informal settlements and the right to food in this context. So I would like to thank our panelists. Dr. Hassan Ruba, I think he left already, but I'd like to thank him here very much for his participation via Zoom and his important input, as well Dr. Celine Nyamo. Thank you very much for being with us, and Dr. Daniel Maingi. thank you very much for being here. I think it was a very interesting and insightful discussion. Actually, we could say discussions. We touched on so many different issues.
I belong to those people who want to change the world for the better. So I came and I joined. I came at the very tail end. I found my brother here presenting passionately on GMO. And maybe we are currently debating the issue of GMO in Parliament. And some of us have insisted that we need to get external expertise to inform the debate. Because the other day somebody woke up and passionately spoke about hybrids being GMO. You could not distinguish between gene selection and gene manipulation. So we felt that we should suspend the proceedings and organize to invite experts to come and inform the debate. So maybe when the time comes, we will do so. I will also pray that maybe if you have got a mailing list where you organize this kind of fora, you kindly include me so that I can also participate in these important things on earth. I might just get my entry into heaven that way. So I must say that what you are doing here is very important, not just for Kenya, but for the world. We must debate, we must inquire, and eventually we find a way out and a way forward. So I think what you are doing is very, very important, and I'm honored to be here. And so I'm dressed like a cartoon, wearing open shoes. I injured my leg playing football. I think I still play football at 60 because I don't eat GMO food. I don't know. Maybe I do, I don't know. But I think it's a very serious topic that we need to engage in a very sober way. It is something that is new. It is something that I know mankind can manage. I was listening to BBC, which is my favorite media channel, a few days ago, and there was a discussant there who said, in the 60s, when he was a young person, I think in college, there were about 3 billion people on Earth. And the fear was that there was a likelihood of people going to 4 billion, and the globe will not be able to feed them. Today, you have got 8 billion people who are being fed by the same planet. So we need maybe to exhaust the potentials and whatever. But I fully agree with the theme that there are structural causes to food shortage. The food shortage we have has political reasons. It has got design reasons. And maybe if you just try to reach out to our clerk of the Senate, we are only 47 senators who vote. The National Assembly has slightly more people, about 300. But if you reach out to the clerk of the Senate, who is a very progressive fellow, and asked him to inform members that this kind of thing is going to take place, I'm sure you'll have people who will come here and people who influence decisions. Then they can go and make informed decisions. The problems we have in this country is that many decision makers are not informed. So try to invite people to come here. And for the temporary time I'm serving as a senator, me, I'm an activist until the end. Temporarily doing a side job as a senator. My main job is an activist. And those who know me know that. We have to speak straight, we have to speak truth to power, and we have to demand that all of us matter. Irrespective of our station in life, we all matter. And we must keep on repeating that thing. And when you say that you are looking to deal with hunger, you are not talking about people in this room. You are talking about the destitute. I don't think you yourselves here don't need this topic. You don't. But to realize that there's somebody else who needs it, that's why you are doing it. And you are being your brother's keeper. So by being your brother's keeper, you do a very important job. And I would really ask that you don't seclude yourself. Let people know that you are doing these things. Get the address of the clerk to the Senate, the address of the clerk to the National Assembly. Inform them of these processes. I'm sure you'll get 4 or 5 people coming here. And when they leave here, they will go and not publish a book, but they will make a law. And when they make a law, they affect everybody. That's the power a politician has. He's a decision maker, but unless you make use of him, you'll go nowhere. Finally, as I've said, I'm an activist. I have a seat in the Senate. I'm independent. I don't belong to Kenya Kwanza. I don't belong to Azimio. If you have any agenda that you would like to be given a national limelight through the political process, reach out to me. We can sit together. We can formulate bills. We can move bills. Please, let us make use of that chance. And I want to make a difference. But I can't make a difference if I walk alone away from my fellow activists. Will you embrace me? Will you bring me agenda? Please do.